Hello everybody and welcome if you're new here. My name is Athena Meller and my YouTube channel is dedicated to inspiring people to get outdoors. I also run a website called Ramble Guides, which is filled with hikes, pubs, cafes and more in UK national parks. I've been wanting to sit down for a little while and chat about some of my past adventures that I did before I started YouTube, because I get asked about them all the time and hopefully they might inspire you to go on your own little adventure. The first of those is the West Highland Way. In brief, the West Highland Way is a 96-mile hiking trail in Scotland that starts in Mulgai and ends in Fort William, passing the rocky wooded shores of Loch Lomond, the barren expanse of Rannoch Moor and the romantic mountains of Glencoe. I did the West Highland Way solo in 2017 and it was my first long distance hiking trail as well as my first solo wild camp. I think it's a great trail if you're looking to do your first long distance hike or if you're wanting to explore more of the Scottish Highlands on foot. So the first thing you might be wondering is why hike the West Highland Way? Personally, for me, I'd already done some big solo long distance cycling trips in New Zealand and America, and for the past year before I did the trail, I'd been getting more and more into hiking, so I'd done some big kind of up to 20-mile hikes in the Lake District, Peak District and Snowdonia, either solo or with my dog or maybe with a friend. And I was really looking to kind of push myself a little bit further. I'd never done a solo wild camp and the idea of it really scared me. So in a way I kind of felt doing a solo long distance hiking trip would be a way to push myself to do that, but it would also be kind of the next step in my kind of personal development in hiking. There were a few main reasons that I felt that the West Highland Way would be appropriate for me. The first of those is that it felt very accessible. It's in my home nation, so I didn't need any kind of specialist hiking or camping equipment for the climate. Secondly, you can access it by public transport, so by taking a train to Glasgow and then a local train to Mulgai to the start. And then when you reach Fort William, I booked a coach all the way back to Glasgow and then a train back to my home in Manchester at the time. Next, it's 96 miles, so it takes 5 to 6 days, which isn't a super long time. It's a really good amount of time, I think, when you're first doing a long distance trail. And it's super well signposted throughout, so though I did take a map and compass, I honestly didn't really need to use either. However, saying that, I do think it's really important that you do know how to map read and use a compass, because some of the sections on the trail in bad conditions, they would be quite difficult to navigate because it's just like big expanses of wilderness. The next reason is that I would consider it to be a very safe trail to do. Though I did mention there are some sections of wilderness, you do pass through villages quite regularly throughout the trail, and I never needed to fill up with water or food for more than 2 days. It's also possible to stay in B&Bs, campsites and hotels for the entire way, or you can wild camp the whole way as well. And depending on when you do it, you are very likely to meet other people on the trail because it is quite popular, but you still feel relatively isolated in a good way without feeling unsafe or completely alone. Next, it's pretty cheap to do, especially if you already have the majority of the hiking and camping gear you need and you take public transport to the start and you choose to wild camp the whole way. And finally, the landscapes is obviously a major reason to do the trail. You get to pass through Glencoe, which is amazing, filled with these really wild mountains. Rannoch Moor feels really barren, and the really beautiful wooded shores of Loch Lomond as well. So that is some information on the trail in a nutshell, and now I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the way I broke down the trail and kind of a day-to-day guide to how to hike the West Highland Way. Okay, so day one, setting off from Mulgai. As I travelled up to Scotland from Yorkshire, I didn't get on the trail till about 2 in the afternoon, I think it was. And I remember it being a little bit difficult navigating out of Mulgai as it is in any town. You kind of go through a little bit of woodland. After that, I ended up hiking about 12 miles and I didn't have any expectations for how far I would hike. I just thought, oh, I'll just see how far I can get in this kind of half a day. But it's relatively flat, kind of easy terrain. I wouldn't say the landscapes are super interesting, but I was really excited to be on the trail. I remember that my bag felt quite heavy, but I was just like in a really good mood, which I think is why I hiked quite far on that day, or further than I thought anyway. I remember I filled up my water bladder in Drimmen and then I chose a camp spot just before dark in the woods just before Conic Hill. This was my first solo wild camp and I was definitely very nervous. In hindsight, I didn't pick the best spot because I was quite close to the footpath and I did remember hearing the gate open and close in the night, which really scared me. I definitely didn't sleep very well, but I think that's kind of normal for your first solo wild camp. I also remember waking up in the night and thinking that someone was shining a torch into my tent because it was so bright, and it took a lot of courage to open up my tent door and look outside, and I saw the moon just beaming between the trees. It was just so bright. It must have been a full moon or something that night, which was just kind of incredible and really, yeah, just such a nice way to have my first solo wild camp on the trail. Though I was pretty tired the next morning, I remember waking up really early and passing quite a lot of tents of other people wild camping on the trail as I started heading out towards Conic Hill, which was definitely a good way to wake up. Though it isn't a massive hill, it definitely woke me up that morning and I had the most beautiful views looking down to Loch Lomond and the Arrochar Alps on the other side of the lake. I dropped down into Balmahar and actually met up with my dad, who had given me a lift up to Scotland and who was just spending a few days in the area, and he bought me a cup of tea and a scone before I headed back on the trail. After that, I continued hiking along the banks of Loch Lomond and I had kind of a rough aim in my mind to try and get to the Rowchoish Bothy, which was 19 miles altogether. I was actually really nervous to go into the Bothy by myself. It was almost more nerve-wracking than solo wild camping because I knew there would be other people in there and I didn't know what kind of people they would be. They actually ended up being so nice. Everyone was hiking the trail, everyone was super friendly, and I ended up hiking with a few of the people I met in the Bothy for the rest of the week, but kind of on and off. So I would kind of meet up with them at campsites or walk little parts of the trail with them, which was really, really nice. The Bothy is pretty basic but comfortable with a little log burner, and we all sat in front of the fire in the evening sharing stories and drinking hot chocolate, which is a very nice way to spend a rainy evening in a Bothy in Scotland. On day 3, I woke up to quite a lot of rain and I ended up hiking with some of the guys I met in the Bothy for most of that day actually. It just rained all day long, and I remember that section at the very northern end of Loch Lomond being very kind of arduous. You're kind of clambering over a lot of boulders. It's pretty tricky with a backpack. Just very slow going terrain. And then finally we started heading out of the trees and into the hills, and I remember feeling really excited to finally be going into the hills because the hills is really where my heart lies. But it was super rainy, there weren't a lot of views, but I still, I felt really happy to be walking and chatting to these people I'd met. So yeah, it was a great day. And yeah, because it had rained all day, I ended up dropping down into Rannoch and staying in the youth hostel there, which was definitely a good idea because I could have a hot shower and dry my clothes for the next 3 days on the trail. The next day was probably my favourite day on the trail. I was back to being alone and I set off from Rannoch Hostel early in the morning before everybody else, and started by hiking up through the forest and down into Tindrum, where a sign tells you that you're going to be entering into a wilderness for 50 kilometres, which is kind of exciting, a little bit scary. I stocked up on snacks and super noodles from the little gas station there and also filled up my water, and then off I went. As my boots had gotten really wet in all the rain the day before, I had a few blisters forming, which was a little bit painful, but the sun was out and I was in such a good mood because the views were absolutely amazing that day. I was hiking along a trail which runs next to the Highland Railway, and I remember just being really blown away and just in such a good mood by the views. It was kind of showering and sunny all day long, so I saw maybe 3 or 4 rainbows that day, and I descended down to Loch Lomond with a rainbow over it, and it looked really autumnal. It was kind of it was early October, sorry, at that point, so it was starting to look really autumnal there. I thought I was going to wild camp that night, but I couldn't really find an appropriate spot because there was a lot of thick heather and really wet ground from all the recent rain. So I ended up staying at what they called a primitive campground of an old hotel on the banks of the loch, and it was basically just like a little grassy patch of grass a few hundred meters away from the hotel. There was just one other tent there, and to be honest, because my first night wild camping had been a little bit scary, it was really nice feeling a little bit more reassured by having another tent there. I actually ended up having an awful night's sleep because I was stalked by a rutting stag all night. I'm not sure if you've ever heard a stag rutting, but it is the loudest, most terrifying sound. And at one point the stag, I think, was very, very close to outside my tent, and it was really scary but also kind of fascinating, and definitely a night I won't be forgetting. Day 5 is probably the day with the grandest views and biggest landscapes. You start by crossing Rannoch Moor and then head into Glencoe with the looming figure of Buccleuch Moor in front of you, which is just absolutely amazing. You then ascend something called Devil's Staircase to the highest point on the trail, which is 550 metres, which isn't very high, and to be honest, the staircase was really not as hard as I thought it would be. I think I was pretty accustomed to carrying my backpack by then. And then there is a very long descent down to Loch Lomond, which I remember being quite arduous because it's just a long way downhill, pretty hard on your knees. Walking poles would definitely have been good, but I wasn't really using them back then. This was actually the most difficult day for me emotionally. I think I was just feeling really physically tired, and after not sleeping the night before, I was just feeling a whole lot of emotions, which I think is quite normal when you do a long distance hiking trail like this, especially alone. I remember just being very kind of lost in my head and thinking a lot about the things I'd kind of been trying to run away from by doing this trail, but it was a really good kind of purging of emotion. I did just actually walk and cry for a lot of that day. Because I was staying in a village that night, I was staying in Loch Lomond, I ended up staying in a campsite, which is where most of the people hiking the trail were, and I ended up meeting a couple of guys who were really nice, and we went to the pub together, and it was a really nice end to the day, and it was actually really welcome to have a little bit of social interaction after being a little bit kind of lost in my head for most of the day. And finally, day 6, from Loch Lomond to Fort William. This is a fairly short 13-mile day, descending through Glen Nevis into Fort William. I remember this day, I was just so into the swing of hiking. I was feeling in the best mood, the views were really nice. I just didn't want it to end. I walked pretty slowly because I was just taking it all in, taking a lot of photos. I think by day 6, you really just feel like you could keep walking, but you get to Fort William and it's kind of the end and you're a bit like, oh, what now? And that was it. I spent that night in a hostel in Fort William, and then I had another day to kill in Fort William the following day, which is when I actually met my now boyfriend of 3 years, Harvey. So this trail is kind of special to me because not only was it my first solo wild camp, my first solo long distance hiking trail, but I think that having that confidence from hiking the trail made feeling like you could talk to a random stranger in a cafe totally normal, which is what I did, and 3 years later I'm still with my partner, so it's kind of a special trail for me for that reason as well. So if you don't already know, I have set up a Patreon community called the Ramble Community, and I asked my little community for a few questions on the West Highland Way that I'm going to answer now. The first is from Yannicka, and she says, so curious to hear about your experiences hiking solo. A solo long distance hiking trip has definitely been on my bucket list for a solid year now. I would be interested to hear how you went about planning for it, if you actually did, e.g. saving up, acquiring gear, getting the time off from work or studying, and perhaps some of the expectations you had that turned out differently. So for me, as Scotland is in my home nation, it didn't require, I think, as much planning as if you were going to be flying over from abroad to do the trail. All I really did was buy this book online, which is the official guide to the West Highland Way, and I had a little glance through it before I was going to do the trail. I was already pretty used to doing long hikes, so I didn't really train for it either, and I already had all the hiking and camping gear that I needed because I'd been doing a lot of hiking and camping around, and I'd already done a solo big cycling trip. So yeah, to be honest, I didn't really plan a lot for it. Not that I'm saying you should follow my advice. I just knew I really wanted to do it, and it was almost like forcing myself to do it meant not thinking about it too much and just getting on the trail and going and kind of dealing with everything day by day. So I would read the following day when I got to in this guidebook, when I got to my camp. And then expectations I had that turned out differently. That's a tricky one actually, because it was a fair while ago now, and I don't really remember what my expectations for it were. I definitely felt like I could have carried on after it. I felt like I could have just kept walking and walking. It also fulfilled that kind of, I guess, fairly stereotypical expectation that you do think about a lot when you're solo hiking, and you do kind of have a bit of a purge of emotion, as I mentioned before. I definitely didn't expect to meet my now partner of 3 years at the end of the trail, but I met some amazing people while I was on the trail as well, which I think that exceeded my expectations because I thought I was going to be alone for a lot of it. I did it in early October, which is a very quiet time on the trail, as most people do it in the summer, but personally I would recommend doing it in either spring or autumn. The next question is from Ashley, and she says that she's just bought the book on the West Highland Way as it's on her list of things to do. When wild camping, what time would be acceptable to pitch your tent? Good question. And it's definitely something that I was maybe a little bit nervous of before I did my first solo wild camp. For me, I mean, it really depends on the time of year and where you are and when it's getting dark and all of that. But I would probably recommend pitching your tent at least an hour before it gets dark. If you want to have time to pitch your tent, make your dinner, and kind of enjoy the scenery before it gets dark. So I don't actually remember what time it was getting dark when I did the trail, but I was pitching my tent very close or around an hour before sunset. But I remember my first night while camping on the trail, I was really late because I kind of knew where I wanted to get, and I knew I just wanted to get into this woodland, and I was really pushing it for time, and I think I pitched only about 20 minutes before sunset, and I had to make my dinner in the dark, which wasn't ideal because I wanted to feel comfortable where I was and kind of enjoy it a bit more. So yeah, I would recommend pitching your tent around an hour before sunset wherever you are. And the final question is from Anthi. I think hopefully I am pronouncing that right. And she said, I actually did the trail when I was 17 and very young and inexperienced, and I cried a lot. It was not very busy at the time, but that was 8 years ago. I have always wanted to walk it again as a grown-up, but I've heard that the trail has become much busier since, and that you're not allowed to wild camp anymore. Do you know anything about that? I also wonder whether you brought all your food in advance or whether you shopped along the way. So in terms of busyness on the trail, as I mentioned, I did the trail in October, which I think is a really good time of year. It is getting a little bit chillier and the weather is a little bit more temperamental, but the trail was pretty quiet. Like, as I mentioned, I did meet other people, but for the majority of the time, I could just be hiking alone. I think in summer, the banks of Loch Lomond get really busy, so yeah, personally I recommend doing it in kind of early springtime, maybe April, May, or in late September, early October. I was definitely pushing it a little bit in terms of when I did the trail, but it turned out really good for me. I had a lot of freedom, but also met people on the way. In terms of wild camping on the trail, as far as I'm aware, yes, you can wild camp all the way due to the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, which means that you're allowed to wild camp if you've just got like a lightweight setup and only in small groups and for no more than 2 or 3 nights in one place. However, there are some bylaws to this, and one of those bylaws is Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park. So they actually have a law that says that you cannot wild camp in some sections of the park, and this is actually the section where the trail goes beside the lake from March to September. Obviously I did it in October, so it wasn't an issue for me, but if you are planning on doing the trail between March and September, do be aware that you are not allowed to wild camp on the banks of Loch Lomond, and there are signs that tell you from what section you can't wild camp and then when you are allowed to wild camp again, so it's really well signposted. Now you can actually get around this by staying in the bothy, which is what I did. So I didn't actually wild camp anyway between those sections where you can't wild camp, because I camped the night before on the other side of the national park and on the other side of Conic Hill, and then I stayed in the bothy when I was on the banks. So either you have to hike that whole section in all one day, which would make quite a long day, or you can stay in the bothy, which is what I imagine most people do anyway. But other than that, because of the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, as long as you are responsible, you take all your rubbish away with you, and you're not camping on public land, which is normally on private land, which is normally pretty obvious where that is, you can wild camp anywhere in Scotland, which is amazing, apart from where these bylaws are, of course. And then finally, the question about buying my food in advance or shopping. I'm pretty sure that when I set off on the trail, I had maybe 2 or 3 days worth of food. I think at the time I was just eating things like super noodles or those like packet pasta things, so really lightweight stuff. But it's actually quite easy to fill up with food along the way as you pass through a few different villages. So there's definitely a store at Balmaha, which is quite expensive, but if you really need to fill up with or to stock up with some food, you can fill up there, and that is on Loch Lomond. After that, I think the next place would be Crian Larrick, where there is a little store, and I stayed in the youth hostel there. And then there's Tindrum as well, where there is I definitely stocked up from like a gas station type or petrol station type place with just some like basics, but it depends what you're wanting to eat. If you're wanting to eat like good fresh food, then you might want to stock up before the whole trail. But if you're just happy to eat the kind of things that you can buy from little shops like tins of stuff or packet noodles or whatever, then you can pretty much fill up all the way. Also, when you get to Loch Lomond, that is quite a big town, so you can fully fill up there. I remember there was a co-op and I was really excited to buy a few treats. There's also like fish and chips there and a pub there, so there's quite a lot there as well. And as you're going through Glencoe, there is a like the mountain cafe there that you could stop in if you wanted to get a bite to eat or anything like that. In terms of water, I was able to fill up my water bladder every single day, whether it be from a pub or a cafe or like random taps that were just around, so that was very easy, and that was definitely something I was worried about before I did the trail though. Okay, so hopefully you found this little mini guide to hiking the West Highland Way helpful. Do feel free to ask me any questions down below, and if I get a lot of questions, I might do another Q&A just on the West Highland Way if that would be of interest to you guys. I have also written a blog post on hiking the West Highland Way, which I will link down below. If you'd like to see a little bit more from me, I do also have a Patreon community called the Ramble Community, where for £4 a month you get access to a private Facebook group where people can kind of interact with each other about hiking or ask me about any of my personal adventures. I also make a PDF resource sheet every month, which will either be kind of hiking, camping advice, a hiking guide, or a trail recipe. And the link for that will be down below as well. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful and inspiring, and I'll see you guys in the next one.